She was the quiet girl in the small town, the kind who lived between pages of books and the hush of her own dreams. No one expected her to marry the delivery guy of all people, least of all her. But when his wallet slipped from his pocket, one morning and a black card gleamed from its folds, her world, so carefully built on trust and simplicity, began to crumble. Can love survive a truth kept hidden not out of malice, but out of fear? Fear of losing the only gaze that ever saw through the noise, straight into the heart. The sky that day wore a sheer veil of cloud, neither grey nor bright, but soft and dreamy, like gauze draped over a love song with no lyrics yet. In the little town of Woodgrove, autumn always arrived reluctantly, lingering just long enough for people to catch the last golden threads of summer before the leaves began to change. Maggie sat behind the register, where sunlight filtered through the glass doors and spilled across the browned book covers, making everything seem to breathe in a hush. Her chestnut hair was tied back with an old fabric band, and her pale butter-colored sweater had loose threads at the cuffs. She wasn't the kind of beautiful that turned heads, but her face held something quiet and enduring, something that made people linger just a few seconds longer than they meant to. Maybe it was the stillness of someone who never felt the need to rush. The bell over the door chimed softly. Even such a small sound startled Maggie. She looked up just as her eyes met Mr. Pearson's, an older customer waiting by the back shelf. "Could you hurry up?" he muttered, voice gravelly like a worn-out radio. "My wife's been waiting in the car." Maggie bowed her head, mumbling an apology, her hand trembling as she scanned the barcode. She wasn't good with moments like these. She knew that, and hated herself for it. Every time someone pressed her, it felt like being yanked out of the quiet world she'd built, where things could unfold slowly, where there was still time to feel every line on a page. Only after Mr. Pearson left, with a loud sigh, and the receipt crumpled in his fist, did Maggie dare to raise her face again. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She was about to return to shelving books when the bell above the door rang again. But this time, no impatient footsteps. No clipped voice, just a soft laugh and a warm, low voice. "Sorry I'm late with today's delivery." A man in his 30s walked in, tall and calm in a way that seemed to settle the room. He wore a plain grey jacket, jeans worn thin at the knees, and sneakers that looked like they'd carried him far. A baseball cap shaded his face, but couldn't hide his eyes, clear and warm, like the first winter light slipping through pine branches. He approached the counter, carrying a box labelled with the bookstore's name. "Delivery from Robin's Nest Press. Mind signing for it?" Maggie nodded and reached for the pen, but her hand shook slightly. As she handed the slip back, the pen fell to the floor. She bent to retrieve it, too quickly, and so did Had. Their hands brushed. His fingers barely touched hers, but it sent a flicker through her chest. She looked up, startled to find how close they were. He smiled, not the kind people wear out of politeness, but something real, light and unguarded. "Sorry about that," he said. "Didn't mean to. I'm always dropping things, maybe because my hands are always cold." She gave a tiny nod, heart pounding. Not because he was handsome, but because he hadn't rushed her. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't like the others. "What, you work here long?" he asked while she signed the receipt. "Almost 6 years," she murmured, afraid her answer was somehow too much. "Then I bet you've got a favorite shelf by now," he said, smiling again. The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that. No one had ever cared what the cashier liked. She nodded slightly and pointed toward the corner, where a warm yellow lamp cast a glow over the oak shelves. There sat Little Women, Anne of Green Gables, and a special edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, the book she reread every fall. "Perfect," he said. "Next time I'll try one from that shelf." Just before leaving, he looked back. "I'm Alex. I deliver here every Monday morning. If you've got a favorite book, recommend one next time." Maggie didn't answer, but she nodded. And when the door closed behind him, the chime soft again, she didn't move, just stood, eyes fixed on the space he'd left behind. In that moment, the weight of the morning, every snap, every sigh, every heaviness, dissolved. What lingered was the quiet, stunning realization that someone had seen her. And before she could stop herself, a thought rose up, clear and wild. He walked in like the main character in a story I hadn't read yet. Maggie sat down, opened the small notebook where she wrote the things no one ever asked. She wrote, "Monday, first day of fall. Someone asked about my favorite shelf. For the first time, and for some reason, that made her feel like she might be a little unforgettable." The Maple and Fern bookstore was as quiet as every other autumn morning in Woodgrove, but today Maggie's heart didn't share in that stillness. She stood by the corner shelf where slanted sunlight streamed through the front window, laying golden stripes across the spines of old books. Her fingers drifted along the rows, searching for something familiar, but not for herself, not this time. Alex was coming back this morning, and she was doing something she didn't quite dare name. Maggie pulled out a moss-green cloth-bound copy, Bridge to Terabithia. It wasn't her usual pick, but it was the first book that had ever made her cry. She remembered reading it in her bedroom one winter when she was 9, after being teased at school for always carrying books in her backpack instead of toys. She hadn't cried at the ending. She cried because, for the first time, a character had understood her better than any real person had. She opened the first page. Beneath the author's name, a faint line of pencil from long ago. If a place like Terabithia really existed, I'd live there forever. She hesitated. Her hand almost tore the page, but instead, she closed the book gently and tied a soft brown ribbon around it. Not like a gift, not exactly. More like something more personal than that. She placed it on the counter, just within reach, so if Alex came in and asked, she could pretend to stumble upon it. 9, 3, The wind chime jingled again. Soft, familiar, like the opening notes of a lullaby you haven't heard since childhood. "Good morning," came Alex's voice, slightly husky, like someone who just walked through the fog. "Quiet here today, huh?" Maggie offered. A small smile. "It's always quiet here, like everything else in this town." He nodded, handed over the box as usual, but this time he didn't leave. He looked around the shop, then gestured toward the old bookshelf bathed in sun. "You said that was your favorite corner," he said. "Is there a book you've read that still stays with you?" Maggie was silent for a heartbeat. She didn't meet his eyes, just turned and stepped toward the counter, where the ribbon-wrapped book waited. She picked it up, her hand slightly trembling, though her voice was steady in a way that surprised her. "This one, it's part of who I was. I don't know if it's your kind of story, but..." Alex took the book, his gaze moving over the cover like he'd just touched something sacred. Bridge to Terabithia. Haven't heard that title in years. He sank into the wicker chair near the counter, opened the book and paused when he saw the faded pencil line at the top. Maggie lowered her head, murmuring, "I'm sorry. I forgot that was there." "Don't be," Alex said, his voice softer now. "That line, and it reminds me I used to be a kid who dreamed of things no one else understood." The air inside the bookstore thickened with something unspoken. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the wind nudged the glass and the scent of old pine shelves drifted gently through the room. Finally, Alex smiled, just a hint. "You know, I'm not the first person to ask you about books, but I think I might be the first who really listened to your answer." Maggie blinked, and for the first time in years, she felt like that sentence might actually be true. "Next week," Alex said, rising to go, "I'll bring you a book I've kept since middle school. Fair trade." She nodded. This time she didn't blush. Not because she'd grown braver, but because something inside her had started to believe that if she kept seeing Alex every Monday, her heart might remember how to open again, slowly, gently, and as had become a quiet ritual, once the door closed behind him, Maggie opened her small notebook and wrote, "Monday, week 2. The book is no longer only mine. Maybe memories too can be shared." Saturday afternoon cast Woodgrove in a silvery grey, not gloomy, not cold, but like velvet draped over the town, softening every sound and slowing every motion. Maggie stood by the edge of the lake, her hair loose, strands brushing the collar of her beige knit coat. Her hands were tucked in her pockets, her gaze following the mirrored surface of the water, still and whispering like a secret kept too long. The wooden bench where she often read was no longer hers alone. Alex had arrived. He approached with 2 cups of steaming tea from the corner cafe. The scent of ginger and cinnamon curled through the damp autumn air, blending with the hush of the afternoon. He didn't greet her. They were past that now. A glance was enough to say, "I've been waiting for this all week. Looks like we're the only ones walking today," Maggie said with a smile, casting her eyes around the empty path. Only a few fallen leaves spun in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance ducks moved through the water with sleepy grace. "The fewer the better," Alex replied with a wink, handing her a cup. "I like when I can actually hear you breathe." "In a place like this," she faltered, not because the words were overly romantic, but because of how gently he said them. "Like rain just before it falls." Like something meant, not rehearsed. They walked along the lake's edge, slow steps crunching the soft, wet earth. The sky let loose its first drops, rain so light it seemed to apologize as it touched them. "I like the rain," Maggie said, pulling her collar higher. "It slows everything down, makes it feel like there's time to think." Alex didn't answer. She turned and saw him standing still. His eyes no longer carried that soft, winter-light calm. There was something distant in them, something troubled. "Alec?" she asked, voice low. He pressed a hand to his forehead, his breath catching. His chest rose and fell too fast. His lips had gone pale. "I'm fine," he murmured, shaking his head. "Just dizzy sometimes. When the wind changes, or when the smell of wet earth brings back." He didn't finish. Maggie didn't press. She didn't need to know the reason. Not now. She simply stepped closer, laid a hand on his arm, not holding, just touching. Just enough to say, "I'm here." "Let's sit," she said, her voice as calm as the line of a familiar story. "We'll wait for the rain to ease up." They sat on the stone bench. Alex kept his cup in both hands, though they trembled slightly. Maggie reached into her coat and pulled out a tissue, one of the soft ones she'd carried since childhood, back when allergies made her eyes water at the slightest breeze, and handed it to him. It was such a small thing, but to Alex, it was everything he needed in that moment. No panic, just presence, just someone who showed up. Rain fell steadily now, darkening the shoulders of his coat, curling her hair into damp wisps. Maggie stared out at the lake and said quietly, "Not," looking at him. "I used to be like that too. When I was little, rain would send me into a panic. Not because I was afraid of storms, but because it reminded me of the day I lost my mum." Alex turned. For the first time, he saw her eyes steady and unflinching, not filled with sadness, just stitched carefully around an old memory. "It's different now," she went on. "I learned to walk in the rain, because if I kept hiding, I'd spend my whole life indoors, imagining the sky instead of feeling it." Alex smiled. The kind of smile that comes when something locked inside finally slips free. "You know," he whispered, "the rain doesn't make me cold, but your touch, and it made me shake." Maggie didn't answer. She looked down at her hand, resting next to his on the bench, the space between them thin as a thread. Then she tilted her head and leaned it lightly against his shoulder, not pressing, just enough so he could feel the quiet of her heart. The rain continued. Alex's breath steadied, and they sat like that. Two people who moved slowly in a world that moved too fast, two hearts that had once gotten lost inside their own silence, now resting in the hush of each other. When the rain began to lift, Maggie raised her head. "Do you feel better?" Alex nodded. "Better than ever." They stood, walked on beneath a sky still soft with drizzle, and from that day forward, they were no longer just a delivery man and a bookstore girl. They were two people who shared a Saturday afternoon in the rain and a secret that needed no words at all. Summer mornings in Woodgrove were as soft as a whisper after a night of rain. Everything moved slower, quieter, as if nature itself were holding its breath, waiting for something important to happen, something that didn't need to announce itself. Maggie sat by the window of her grandmother's house, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands, her eyes fixed on the little garden out back, where Alex was carefully wiping down each wooden chair. She didn't watch him like a woman watching the man she was about to marry. She watched him like someone witnessing a rare kind of stillness made visible. Today was their wedding day. After a season of slow, steady becoming, two people, who had met by chance with a cardboard box of books and a quiet glance, had found in each other their place to land. There was no lace gown, no orchestra, no invitations pressed on heavy white cardstock, just a handful of familiar faces, Maggie's grandmother, her closest friend from the bookstore, and the elderly neighbor who once lent them chairs. Alex wore a white shirt, khaki trousers, and a sprig of lavender pinned to his chest. Maggie wore an ivory cotton dress that brushed her ankles, the sleeves puffed just so, her hair tied with a pale violet ribbon. They chose to marry in the garden, among the lavender. Bushes and soft grass near the old wooden table where Maggie used to read. There was no officiant, no readings, just a promise, a look, and two hearts beating in rhythm. But before petals floated through the breeze and vows were spoken, there had been a moment no one saw. The night before, Alex stood on the porch, a phone in his hand, listening to a UI. Voice on the other end, low, brittle, and laced with doubt. "Are you sure about this?" the man asked. "A girl who works at a little bookstore, who knows nothing about your world. Where do you plan to take her? One day she'll resent you for bringing her somewhere she never belonged." Alex didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the porch light. When he finally hung up, he walked inside, where Maggie was lighting candles near the dinner table. She looked at him, not questioning, not guessing, just a look deep enough to know something had stirred inside him. "Are you scared?" she asked softly. He shook his head, then nodded. "I'm scared. But not of you. I'm scared because I've never had something so real to be afraid of losing." Maggie didn't speak. She stepped forward, rested her hand on his chest. "We don't need a wedding, just a golden afternoon where I can say yes. And..." The sky today indeed was golden enough. They stood together beneath a wildflower arch. No one walked her down the aisle, no veil to lift. Just two people approaching from different paths, meeting in air thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass. Alex looked at her, his eyes holding something deeper than love. Gratitude. "I used to think my life could never be ordinary," he said. "But you're the quiet miracle of ordinary I never dared to wish for." Maggie smiled, her eyes damp. "And I," she said, "used to believe no one saw me, that no one would ever choose me. Until the day you asked, 'Which book did you like this week?'" They exchanged rings, simple, smooth silver bands, no gemstones. But as Maggie slipped his onto his finger, she thought, worth isn't in the shine, but in the reason we choose to keep something forever. A small ripple of applause rose from their guests. Maggie's grandmother gripped her hand tightly, whispering, "You've just become the bravest girl I've ever known." At the backyard reception, there was apple pie, blueberry juice, and a radio humming soft jazz. Maggie and Alex sat on the wooden steps, no dancing, no cinematic kiss, just two people leaning into one another, sharing breath. And when night fell and the garden glowed with candlelight, Maggie quietly placed the first book Alex had ever read, Bridge to Terabithia, at the center of the wedding table, nestled inside a wreath of lavender. A small reminder. It all began with a book, a question, and someone quiet enough to truly listen. Late in the afternoon, a week after the wedding, Maggie and Alex's small house still carried the scent of dried lavender and toasted bread from breakfast. The last of the daylight slanted through the window, casting an amber glow across the wooden floor. Maggie was tidying the cabinet in the living room, not because it was cluttered, but because she wanted their new life together to feel as orderly and calm as the way her heart had been lately. Her hand brushed against something unfamiliar in the back of the drawer, a sleek, black leather wallet, not at all like the simple ones Alex usually carried. She hesitated. It felt like she had just opened a drawer in someone else's mind. One she hadn't been invited to explore. She picked up the wallet, meaning to set it aside, but it slipped from her fingers and landed with a soft thud. A few cards spilled out, among them a glossy black bank card embossed with elegant silver letters. Alexander Wright III. Wright Enterprises. Maggie froze. It wasn't the card that stunned her. It was the name. Alexander Wright. Not Alex. The delivery man with the steady eyes and gentle voice, not the one who had once read to her under the rain. Her heart slammed against her chest, thrown out of its usual rhythm. While she was still trying to make sense of what she'd found, she heard Alex's voice coming from his small office at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. His voice didn't sound like the Alex she knew. It was clipped, cold, commanding, the kind of voice you'd hear in a corporate boardroom, not in a house filled with books and lavender. "We can't sign until the Tokyo assets are re-evaluated. Move the meeting to Wednesday. If they don't agree, cancel." Silence, and then again lower this time, but laced with authority. "And remind legal I don't want my wife's name appearing in any of the asset disclosures. They need to understand this is personal." My wife. That voice. It didn't belong to the man she married. It belonged to someone else entirely. Someone wearing a mask. In her own home. Maggie stepped back, carefully placed the wallet on the table, her hands trembling like she might shatter the truth if she moved too quickly. When Alex walked out and saw her standing in the middle of the room, her face pale with confusion, he stopped. He knew. Her eyes didn't ask a question. They were the question. He opened his mouth, but she raised her hand to stop him. "Alexander Wright." Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. "Who is that?" Silence thickened the room. Even time seemed to hold its breath. "I heard you," she said softly. "You don't have to explain." Alex took a step forward, but the space between them wasn't measured in feet anymore. It was a whole world. "When were you going to tell me?" Maggie asked, her eyes steady. "Or were you never planning to?" "I was scared," Alex admitted, exhaling. "Scared that if you knew who I really was, you wouldn't see me anymore. Scared I wouldn't be brave enough to love someone who's not ordinary," Maggie said with a faint smile. But her eyes weren't smiling. They held a wound beginning to bloom, but hiding the truth. "That's not how you protect love," she said. "That's how you build it on wet sand. If the truth can hurt, but hiding it, that's the blade." Alex didn't speak. He knew there were no words, no rehearsed confessions that could unbreak what had just cracked. Maggie turned and walked toward the bedroom. She closed the door, not locked but shut, like a sliver of light left for something not entirely lost. In the soft, early dusk of the room, she sat at the edge of the bed and opened the notebook where she had once recorded the beginnings of them. And for the first time, her hand did not write. That night, Woodgrove was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The wind didn't howl. It simply brushed past the eaves, cautious not to disturb the sleep of a heart freshly cracked. But Maggie didn't sleep. She lay curled on the long chair by the living room window, her notebook open on her lap, its pages as blank as they'd been the night before. Outside, the street lamp cast soft shadows against the wall, the outline of a woman sitting still, hands clasped, eyes fixed on a space that didn't quite exist. Her mind churned with 100 questions she couldn't yet form, and one that rang out with cruel clarity. Who have I been in love with all this time? Alex, the gentle delivery man with the quiet laugh, or Alexander Wright, the name etched in silver on a black card, belonging to a world she'd never been invited into? The next morning brought a soft rain, the kind that once felt romantic like the first time they'd met by the lake. But today it fell with a quiet insistence, like a memory that no longer warmed, but only chilled the back of her neck. She left a letter on the table. Just a few lines. "I need time. Not to think, but to breathe. I'll come back when my heart knows what it still believes." She took only a small bag. Inside was To Kill a Mockingbird, the weathered cloth-bound edition they'd once read together beneath the rain. The book he'd once said was, like you, extraordinary in the way only ordinary things can be. 2 days later, they met again. Not at home, not at the bookstore, not in an office tower, but in a nearly empty cafe at the edge of town, where the walls were painted in soft washes of color and the tables still smelled faintly of varnish and dust. Alex was already there, dressed in a plain white shirt. The same clothes, but not the same man. Not because he looked tired, but because he'd lost the one thing that had made all the rest of his life make sense. Maggie walked in, the book still in her arms. No dress, no makeup, just her olive coat and old boots soaked through at the toes. But to him she was still the quiet grace he had carried through even his coldest meetings. They sat across from each other. Neither reached for a menu. She spoke first. "Did you think I'd fall in love with you? Or with the version you pretended to be?" Alex didn't rush to answer. He met her gaze, steady and unguarded. "I think it started as pretending, but then I couldn't stop. Because when you smiled at me, not for money, not for my name, just for me, I forgot there was ever someone else behind the name Alex." Maggie gave a small, weary smile, not bitter, just bruised. "I can love someone ordinary," she said quietly, "but I can't love someone who didn't trust me enough to be real." She reached into her bag and pulled out the book, the one with the frayed edges, one corner bent, a few pages still dappled with rain. "Do you remember?" she asked, flipping to the first page, the one where they'd scribbled their favorite lines together. "We read this in the rain. This page," she pointed, smudged, but still legible. Then she turned to another page. A recent one. Ink blurred. The handwriting once hers now melted into blotches. "Like trust," she whispered. "Once soaked through with lies, it's almost impossible to read again." Alex looked down. He didn't defend himself. Maggie stood. She didn't storm out, and she didn't throw the book at him like a goodbye. She left it on the chair between them, not as something discarded, but as something wounded that might still be mended. With enough patience, "I won't say goodbye," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been. "Because I'm not sure this is the end. But if you want to find your way back to the man you used to be, I think this book might still know the way." Then she stepped out into the rain. She didn't open her umbrella. She let the water fall on her hair, her cheeks, her shoulders, as though letting it wash away what sorrow still clung to her. And somewhere deep within, she held to one truth. Real love is never afraid of the truth. It only fears being betrayed by the one it trusted most. The main conference room of Wright Enterprises sat high on the 31st floor, its glass walls opening to the city skyline. But that morning, Alex hadn't looked out once. He sat at the head of the table, his laptop open but blank. The meeting had been underway for 10 minutes, voices circling the table, cool and practiced, dissecting a multi-billion-dollar deal with mechanical precision. But it all felt distant, disconnected, because in his mind, only one thing echoed: she's gone, and she might not come back. His heart felt heavier with each beat, as if every thud carried the weight of a choice he hadn't yet made. "Alexander," came a voice to his right. "Mrs. Dalloway, the company's chief strategist. Do we proceed with the contract this week or push it back?" Every gaze shifted toward him. Alex looked up. He was silent for a few seconds. Then he closed his laptop with a soft, deliberate click, and the room stilled. "If I have to give up everything to hold on to what truly matters, I will," he said, his voice calm but unwavering, a flicker of movement. A furrowed brow from the CFO, a quiet whisper passed between two directors. But Alex didn't elaborate. Not as a CEO, not as an heir, just as a man choosing what made him feel, for once, fully alive. And then the door opened. Maggie stood at the threshold. She wore a pale grey sweater, her arms wrapped around a small object tucked into white linen. Her hair was loose, as always, but her eyes had changed, no longer adrift, but grounded. The gaze of someone who had been broken and had chosen, deliberately, to forgive. No one spoke. Alex rose. He didn't rush toward her, didn't speak. He simply looked at her, as if her presence alone was enough to pull him back from the edge. Maggie stepped forward. In her hands was a handkerchief, worn linen, hand-stitched in dark blue thread with the name Alex. A gift she'd made early in their courtship, tucked once into a book. She placed it on the table. She looked at no one but him. "I didn't come to stop you," she said, her voice soft but clear. I came to tell you, no matter who you are or where you stand, the man I love is still the one who read To Kill a Mockingbird with me, in the rain." Alex blinked, and for a moment he saw her as he had the first time, shy, steady, surprising. The girl who'd once blushed when he asked about her favorite shelf. The girl who'd mended a torn book cover without saying a word. The girl who had loved him before she knew the weight of his last name. Someone at the table cleared their throat, not out of annoyance, but as if to gently dispel the intimacy that had settled over a room built for contracts and negotiations. Alex turned from them to her. "I'd like to end this meeting here," he said quietly, not waiting for a consensus. He walked to where she stood. They didn't embrace. They didn't kiss. They simply stood, just close enough for something, ancient and sacred, to return. "I didn't know you'd come," he murmured. "Neither did I," she replied. "But I knew that if I didn't, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." He reached for the handkerchief, held it tight, like someone finally touching the truest part of himself after too long without it. They walked out together, in silence, and behind them, as the glass door closed, something remained in the air, something no agenda could hold, no minutes could record. Forgiveness, soft as breath, strong enough to quiet everything else. That afternoon, the sky over Woodgrove wore rain again. Not the wild kind, but a quiet drizzle like a promise whispered from the chorus of an old love song. Alex stood beneath the wooden awning of the lakeside park, Bridge to Terabithia in hand, the same copy Maggie had once given him in those early days. The cover was worn, its edges still bearing the faint blooms of water damage, but he had kept it, not just as a memento, but as a part of his memory he hadn't let anyone else touch. He looked out over the lake, the same lake where they'd once read side by side in the season's first rain, where he'd seen her laugh for the first time, freely, without hesitation. Footsteps approached behind him, slow and careful, like each step measured the weight of a feeling returning. He didn't have to turn around. He knew. Maggie drew, near, holding a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, not the one he'd ruined, but a different copy, repaired. The stitches along its dark cloth spine were done in red thread, like a beautiful scar. They didn't greet each other. The rain was light, just enough for them to share its shelter without needing a roof. She handed him the book. "I couldn't fix the smeared pages," she said, eyes on the spine, "but I rewrote the ending. On the last page." Alex opened it, the scent of lavender and rain rising from its pages. On the final leaf, written in soft, uneven script, was a single line: "This chapter isn't over yet." He looked up and met her gaze, the gaze of someone who had learned to trust again even after being hurt. "I know I was wrong to hide the truth," he said. "But if you're still here, I'll learn how to love you all over again." No masks, no pretending. Maggie smiled. Real love doesn't need to be proved. It just needs a place to stand in the rain together. They stepped out from under the awning and walked beneath the drizzle, not rushed, not saying much. Their hands brushed, then laced together, like two people who'd fallen out of rhythm and were now finding their way back into the same song. Rain clung to her hair. Alex reached up, gently sweeping a strand from her forehead, his gaze reading her like a page he'd never truly finished. There was no cinematic kiss, no sweeping score. Just two people, a book, and a rain soft enough to hold all the words they hadn't yet found. As they left the park, the bench behind them held the book, still damp, its final page curling gently in the wind. And in that breeze it was as if a voice rose, not from any mouth, but from somewhere deep within. If love is a story, then the next chapter always begins exactly where we thought it ended. Thank you for listening to this story, a small journey, tender and quiet, where love isn't measured by power or title, but by the way we make each other feel truly seen. If you've ever loved someone imperfectly, ever tucked your pain away, for fear of being broken, then maybe you already know. The bravest kind of love isn't loving someone flawless, it's loving someone real. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe to keep turning pages together, one heartfelt chapter at a time.